So my latest Contax Zeiss pickup, it's not a prime lens. I got a zoom lens. This right here is the Contax Zeiss 35-70 f3.4 MMJ, and it's been one of my most used lenses as of late. So if you've been following along my Contax Zeiss journey, you know that I've been really happy with my Contax Zeiss primes. I talk about them too much on social media, and I pretty much use them for literally everything. I use them on all my client shoots, as well as like my travel films and stuff for YouTube. I just love working with these lenses and the feeling that it gives you, as well as the image quality. I just feel like these lenses pair so well in these modern digital sensors, and it's just such a fun experience for me overall. This 35-70 is truly a hidden gem inside the entire Contax Zeiss line. From all my research, I found that there are three main zooms that fit the focal range that I was looking for. There's a 28-85, the 35-70, and the 28-70. The 28-85, while having the ideal focal range, it's a lot heavier and bigger than the other lenses. The 28-70 had a really nice range because 28 on the wide end is as wide as most people would want to go, but this lens was made in the 90s, which is way newer than all my other Contax Zeiss primes. And the 35-70 was pretty much the Goldilocks option for my needs. It fit the same time frame, so it would match pretty well with my other Contax Zeiss primes. It's small and compact, which was really nice for my Sony FX3. It's still larger than my Contax Zeiss primes, but it's significantly smaller than a modern lens like my Sigma 24-70. So with this lens being small, I honestly don't mind throwing it into my backpack or my lens kit as a +1 just in case. If I had the 28-85, it would probably be a little bit too big for my bag when I'm already carrying like 3 to 4 primes, but because this lens is so small, I honestly don't mind throwing it in my kit because that little bit of extra weight is always worth it having a nice zoom lens around. This lens has the same Contax Zeiss build quality. It's all metal, it's sturdy, it feels great in hand, it has a long focus throw and has an aperture ring, and overall it just creates a really nice shooting experience. This lens does have a slower 3.4 aperture, which I personally don't mind because I primarily stop down on all my shoots anyways. Besides the aperture ring, there's only one ring on this lens, and for being a zoom lens, that's really weird because zoom lenses have a zoom ring and a focus ring, but this lens has a very unique design called one touch or push pull. So essentially, to zoom it out, which is weird, to zoom it out you go out, which is 35 mil, and then to zoom it in, you push it in. 70. With this push-pull design, I was really worried about barrel drift, which, when I hold it upside down, it does not wiggle at all. So as long as that doesn't happen, I'm pretty chilling with it. It was kind of weird to get used to this design, but after working with it for a handful of months, I honestly don't mind it much anymore. When it comes to modding, I did the exact same mods to this lens as I did to all my other Contax Zeiss primes. I added the nicer front ring with the 85 outer and 82 inner diameter. With the 82 inner diameter, I could use my circular filters, and the front ring is just a lot sturdier than the cheaper step-up rings. The front cap with all the info on it is super clutch because I could see what lens I'm actually picking up, as well as the minimum focus distance, which is super convenient to have on set because there are times where you need a lens with a really close focus. I also threw on the EF conversion, which I severely screwed up this lens by doing that. Usually when you're doing the EF conversion, you have to heat up the screws to kind of break up that old glue from the 60s or 70s, and I was a little impatient with it, and I ended up stripping a handful of my screws, which I needed my father's help to kind of drill through it, and we were able to get it out, but then in the midst of it, the whole lens popped off and the aperture ball bearing fell out. So thankfully I was able to get this lens back together, but essentially now my lens is declicked by accident, which I don't really mind too much. I'm not personally a fan of it. I mean, it's smooth, but I am afraid of aperture slip down the road. So I don't know, as long as the aperture doesn't slip, I don't really care, but I do prefer the haptic feedback of a clicked aperture, which is kind of backwards because for video, people like pulling aperture. I just never do. So it's never really like a key item for me in terms of modding. And then you might notice that there's no focus gear on this lens, and I bought one for this lens, but I was stupid and didn't realize that because of the one touch design, the focus gear would be moving back and forth. So it rendered itself pretty useless for me. There might be a way of having like a rod move back and forth if you have a wireless follow focus, but I don't have one. I just have a fixed follow focus that attaches to my 15mm rods. I actually don't mind pulling focus on this lens. I think because the padding of the focus gear is a little bit wider than the other ones, it just feels nice. With my primes, I do prefer having that focus gear even when I'm pulling by my hand. So as I was editing this video, I realized that in my A-roll, I left out a lot of key features and functions. So I want to go through those real quick and get back to the original A-roll recording where I forgot these features. So first things first, this is an MM lens, which essentially is a little bit different than the AE in the sense of the aperture blades are different. The AE lenses often give you a Ninja Star bokeh. Back in the days of the older SLR cameras, MM and AE did a lot more than just bokeh. But for now, on these modern bodies, it's pretty much just a bokeh difference. The optics should be the same, and even though my entire kit is all AE, I don't mind having an MM, one because it's a zoom, and 2, it's still the same thing, and I kind of don't mind not having Ninja Star. It is what it is, but I don't think Contax Zeiss made AE lenses of this. The second thing that I forgot, which is arguably super important, is that this lens has a macro function, but it took me a while to figure out how to actually use it. I should have read the manual, but essentially you extend it out to 35 mil, and then you go all the way over to minimum focus, and you see this little red line, you just go push it over. So now this is at a macro mode, but the weird thing about this macro mode is that you can't focus. So essentially you just have to move the camera in and out to adjust the plane of focus. You're not actually adjusting it, you're just moving it, so then naturally stuff falls in and out of focus. I don't really use the macro function at all. 35 mil at a macro is just kind of weird. I'd rather shoot on a 100mm macro because you just get a lot more compression, and with macro you do need a lot of light. So if you're shooting anything indoors, or you're trying to get those details, you just need to splash tons of level onto the scene, which sometimes it's hard to do. Another important thing is that this lens actually works with the Canon focal reducer. A lot of vintage lenses aren't able to do that because of either protruding elements or like these little pins. This lens has had 0 issues on my Canon 0.71x focal reducer. I run it pretty much 100% of the times on that, so that was never really a concern of mine up until getting the C70, but it works perfectly fine on the Canon focal reducer. Another weird quirk that I found with this lens is that the barrel actually rotates. With my other Contax Zeiss primes, when you focus the lens, the barrel extends, which is fine because that's just the way that the lens focuses. But with this lens, being a zoom lens, the barrel moves back and forth. But the biggest problem is that when you focus it, it rotates. And it took me a long time to figure out this problem, all the way up until I started using polarizers. But the bad thing about using polarizers or VNDs with this lens is that because the barrel actually rotates when you focus it, it is now adjusting the image or the polarization of the filter. So on a normal lens, when you pull your VND or polarizer, you're adjusting the image because the way that the filter is designed, it will cut out light, it'll cut out the reflections and the glare. But on this lens, one, it was really tricky to pull my ND on a VND because when I try to spin the filter, now my lens is spinning and then I'm out of focus. Then on a polarizer, it was a big bummer because I had a sunglasses shoot that I was really looking forward to using my polarizer for it. Immediately I found out that, nope, this is not gonna work because the moment I started to pull focus, my image is now swirling in and out of having a glare and no glare. So that's a forewarning. If you're used to polarizers or VNDs, I would stay away from this lens. I don't know if the other Contax Zeiss lenses spin, so maybe just stay with the primes because the primes don't spin, so you can use your VND, polarizer, and have no issues with it. But yeah, it took me a long time to find that one out, but it's a pretty big issue because I know a lot of people like VND filters. And the last thing that I forgot to mention is that there's this weird red flare that shows up. It's really hard for me to reproduce, but there's been times where I'm reviewing my footage and it looks like I have a dead pixel because the little red flare is so small. It's only popped up on this lens. It's never shown up on any of my other lenses. So it's a little worrisome, but I kind of rarely see that red flare. So it's not too much of a worry. It does show up sometimes, but there are these other weird yellow, smaller flares that do show up with certain angles of light hitting the lens. So that's something to keep in mind. It's usually only showing up, I think, when it's backlit. It is what it is. These are old lenses, and I think it just adds to the quirk of it. But the red flare did freak me out a lot because I thought my camera was ruined. So in terms of image quality, this lens is absolutely stunning. It gives you that classic Contax Zeiss look that's full of character wide open and super sharp when stopped down. This lens is a bit sharper than my Contax Zeiss primes, but it's still funkier than a modern zoom lens. So whenever I describe this lens, I say that it's a healthy mix of the vintage primes and my Sigma 24-70, which for me personally is a great lens to add to the kit because there are those certain shoots that want a modern, cleaner look, but then I don't really want to shoot on a modern stills lens because the experience isn't as nice. I love the workflow of these vintage stills lenses because you have the longer focus throw and the aperture ring. So now adding a lens that's a bit sharper and cleaner than my other lenses is just a really nice thing to have in my kit. And as far as I can tell, this lens matches up perfectly with my Contax Zeiss primes. There's been so many shoots where I've been shooting on primes as well as 35-70. And then when I'm back in the edit, I can't tell what's what until I start seeing if I'm zooming in and out or not while I'm rolling. So for my preferences, this lens matches up perfectly with my Contax Zeiss primes, which is all I can ask for. The workflow with this lens is amazing. I'm so glad that I added it to my kit because there are those certain shoots where having a zoom is just way more convenient than carrying around a bunch of primes. Anytime I'm out in the desert, at the beach, or if I know I'm on a shoot where I won't have enough time to swap lenses, 100% of the time I'm grabbing this lens because it gives me the variety of focal lengths that I need in the short span of time that we have. 35-70 is a pretty solid range for me because 35 is usually as wide as I would go normally, and then 70 is as tight as I'd go. But 70 is a default because most lenses are 24-70. 85 on the long end would be more ideal because I love an 85 prime, and it kind of brings me back to that 28-85 because 28 on the wide end is perfect. 85 on the long end is perfect. With that lens, you get 28, 35, 50, 85, and everything in between. With my lens, I get 35, 50, and 70, and everything in between, which isn't the end of the world. This lens was a great pickup at the time because I only had the FX3. Having a smaller lens just made a lot more sense for my needs at that specific time. Because these lenses are EF and I don't have EF bodies, I need an adapter to attach to my camera body. And with the FX3, because it's so small, if I did FX3 adapter and then a large 28-85, I would always need to rig it up with a lens support to make sure I don't break the adapter, the mount on the back of the lens, or the mount on my camera body. And there are times where I don't want to rig up the FX3, so going for that smaller 35-70 made a lot of sense at that time. Now that I have the C70 and I'm constantly rigging this thing up, I am thinking about picking up that 28-85 because that focal range is ideally perfect because you have just such a wide range and a lot more variety in that one lens. And then having a heavier lens makes shooting handheld easier because there's the physics of it, and then I'm always rigging it up, so I don't really mind adding a lens support to it. But for now, the 35-70 has been a great addition to my kit, and because it's so small, I bring it around literally everywhere. The one weird thing about this lens is something that I overlooked when picking up this lens. With my Contax Zeiss primes, with IBIS, I can manually set the focal length of the lens, so then the IBIS kind of does its thing naturally according to that focal length. And then every time I swap lenses, I can change that focal length in there, and it's not a big deal because it's a part of the process. But with the zoom lens, you're constantly changing your focal lengths a lot of the times while you're shooting, which would make it really annoying because if I'm out shooting run and gun, I'm at 50, okay, gotta set the focal length to 50. If I zoom out to 35, okay, gotta change it to 35, and then so on. I don't want to risk getting IBIS wobble by having the wrong focal length on the lens and then the wrong focal length on the stabilization settings. And I know you could probably set it to 50, which is halfway in between, but still, I don't want to risk anything going wrong and then having all that baked into my footage. So anytime I shot with the FX3, I pretty much just turned stabilization off because it was just not worth the risk for me. So anytime I'm rocking the FX3 stripped down, I'm using the primes because it's easier to lock in the stabilization focal length. If I'm rocking the FX3 rigged up with the monitor, V-mount, all that, of course I'm going to go for the 35-70 because all of that weight helps out with the micro jitters, and I kind of really don't need IBIS at that point. With the C70, there's no IBIS, so it's a wash. I don't have to dial in any settings when I'm using any of my lenses, so it's really not that big of a deal, and it honestly makes it a lot easier to shoot with. So that's one thing to consider if you're shooting on a smaller mirrorless body that has IBIS. Vintage zoom lenses are really annoying to dial in because there's no electronic connectors. If you're using a modern stills lens, the camera and the lens talk back and forth telling each other what focal length that it's at, and then the IBIS is like compensating between like all the focal lengths. So for the vintage zooms, it's a little bit trickier. I don't recommend using IBIS with it unless you want to actually dial in at each focal length, which it just adds time, and at that point you might as well just shoot on primes. So that's something to consider. I completely forgot about that, but now that I have the C70, it's a lot easier to shoot with this lens, and it's a great pairing with the C70. So yeah, that's the Contax Zeiss 35-70. I highly recommend picking up this lens if you're looking for a small, compact, standard zoom. 35-70 is a solid range for a lot of people, but if you're working with the Komodo or C70 or FX6 or anything with a larger body, I think the 28-85 might be a better pickup because of the larger focal range. But for a lot of you watching, you're probably using an FX3 or something similar, so the 35-70 is definitely a solid pickup. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about this lens or the research that I've done or the camera kits that I have, please leave them down below or send me a DM. As always, I have a bunch of sample footage for you guys, and they were shot on the FX3 as well as the Canon C70. The FX3 used the Nisi IRND 3 and 6 stop filters. The Canon C70 had the normal adapter as well as the focal reducer, and I graded all the footage according to my taste. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Take it easy. Peace. Enjoy the footy.